Everyone likes routines, and it's important as a teacher to create a set of good routines and then to stick with them so that the students know where they are and know what to expect. But if you never break out of the rut, the reassurance of a routine becomes the monotony of a fixed habit. Just as it's important to maintain your enthusiasm through constant engagement with new research and new learning, so it's important to experiment with your teaching methods periodically. Some of my most rewarding teaching experiences have come when I've tried something new. It doesn't always work well, and I have had some failures which I'll mention today. But the mere fact of experimenting generates interest for me and for the students. As a teacher, you should always be asking, how could I do this better? How can I help the students to learn this material more effectively? How can an experience I've had in one place be transferred to a different setting? I found that teaching students of different ages is particularly useful, illuminating, and that the insights gleaned from one age group can be brought to bear on my way of teaching a different generation. And I'm clearly not alone in this regard. All the professors I interviewed had had comparable experiences. Try to surprise the students in your classes by occasional deviations from the routine. Maybe intensify the illusion by bringing an expert visitor to class, or behave in a slightly unconventional way to concentrate the students' attention.
One semester I decided that I would just be interrupted maybe every other or every third class by a phone call. And I had a phone installed up in front of the class and it would just ring. One time I came in and I had a ball python. This is a large snake, very friendly snake. I had a graduate student who owned one wrapped around me. I've had Charles Darwin come to my class talking about evolution. I've had Gregor Mendel come. In both of those cases, I would start lecturing and I would get it wrong. Intentionally, I'd be wrong, and then Darwin would come in and interrupt me. And the students were just on the edge of their chairs wondering, why the snake?
Now, medical students are usually preoccupied with studying the details of disease and illness. Professor Jeanette Norden at Vanderbilt breaks that routine sometimes by inviting lay people into the classroom to share with their students the real-life aspects, that is to say, the human aspects, of suffering with a disease.
Periodically through the course, I have individuals come to the class who either have someone in their family who has a neurological disease or they themselves do. And they're not presented as a patient. They're presented as a human being who simply happens to have this disorder. And I ask them to tell the students what this disorder has done to their life as a human being. The day I talk about Alzheimer's disease, the students learn all the facts they need to. That's part of my responsibility. They learn how to diagnose it. That's my responsibility to help them learn that. But then I have a woman come to the class who took care of her husband for 6 years, while the man she loved, the talent she had for being a wife, and the dream she had of them having a long life together were all taken away when he was diagnosed at age 50 with Alzheimer's disease. And I asked the students to listen to this person, listen to what she needed from the physicians, listen to what she didn't need.
As Dr. Norden commented there, the students tend to be excited as they learn how to become effective in the diagnosis and treatment of illness. But of course, their professional excitement can't possibly be shared by those who are suffering from the illness in question, or their caregivers. These talks provide a salutary reminder of the complexity of the situations that they're dealing with. One of my really spectacular failures as a young professor was an experiment of attempting to conduct a course in which I didn't announce the date of the midterm. My idea was to keep the students alert and keep them reviewing the material constantly as the course went on. But it led to open rebellion. Since then, as I've mentioned here, I've come to favour a high degree of predictability in things like the course timetable. That's clearly an experiment that misfired. I believe that as a teacher, it's a good idea, when possible, to bring out students' neglected abilities by challenging them to do unfamiliar activities. I've mentioned in this course that, in my opinion, everybody can draw, but most people stop drawing after about 3rd grade. Why is that? Obviously, we're preoccupied by literacy and numeracy, which is true, but I think it's a great loss that so few people beyond their childhood carry on drawing. Now, a few years ago, I was teaching in Emory's summer school in Oxford, England, where I'd been an undergraduate and where I often go back with groups of our students. And I was teaching a course on the history and architecture of Oxford itself. We'd often have walking tours of Oxford. I mean, obviously, it was a good idea to walk around together to look at the buildings that we were studying. But I'd start to point out some of the characteristics of a building, and I'd noticed that what the students were actually doing was just glancing at them. So I had the idea of making them draw the buildings instead. Sometimes we went together as a group to do it, and sometimes I sent them out on their own to do what they could. Now, at first, there was a lot of resistance from the students, many of whom said, "I can't draw." And it is true that at first, some of them were almost comically bad. On the other hand, a few of them did draw in their free time, and some of them were quite gifted. Now, if you stop drawing when you were 7, and then you start again when you're 20, the sad thing is that you do, in fact, pick up right where you left off. But once you start practicing, in every case, you tend to get better. I can show you here 3 examples of the kind of work the students did. One of the assignments was to draw the arch at the entrance to the Botanical Garden. One of them was to draw St. Mary's Church, which is the parish church of Oxford University itself. And one of them was to draw Hertford Bridge, the bridge which links together the 2 buildings of Hertford College by crossing over New College Lane. And it's one of the famous landmarks of Oxford. This is the college where I had been an undergraduate. Now, when you ask the students to draw the buildings, it forces them to really scrutinize how the masonry works, how the decoration interlaces, the balance of structures, the architectural quotations, the way in which a later building like Hertford Bridge refers back to some of the characteristics of the older ones, like the St. Mary's Church. They have to think about ratio of height to width. They have to think about the placement of windows and exactly how they fit together. The situation of the building in the street with regard to the buildings around them. With some of the students, the ones who were most anxious and most desperate, I gave some basic lessons in perspective in order to help them get started. Now, at the end of that semester, the end of the summer semester there in Oxford, we had a show. Each student had to show his or her 4 best drawings to the rest of the group. And I graded them, not on the architectural quality of the drawings, but on the degree of improvement from the starting point. I did think that this was clearly a case where the grading had to be merciful, since for some of them, some set off at an enormous disadvantage compared to others. But gradually everyone became enthusiastic. It was fun, and it was effective too. It helped the students to understand the special challenges that, for example, Gothic or Baroque architects had in practical matters, actually keeping the roof on. That these buildings, although they're very elaborate, are functional as well as aesthetic. And from then on, if I'd say it's a 2-light mullion window, or this is a mansard roof, everyone would know exactly what I meant. And I'm sure they learned the architecture better through having done the drawing. At Emory also, I always have a few students at the board in the first few minutes as class is beginning, and I say to one, draw a horse, or draw a bicycle, or give us a map of Europe, something relevant to the day's class, as a way of stretching them and a way of breaking the ice as the class begins. Now, just as everybody can draw, so everybody can sing, but most people don't. In fact, most students are passionately reluctant to do so. One of my experiments was that I used to play music at the beginning of every class meeting when I was teaching the introduction to American history. If, for example, I was teaching about Italian immigration to America at the turn of the 20th century, I'd play Italian peasant songs. And if I was teaching about the 1960s, I might play a song by the Beatles or Elvis. But one of the difficulties with that is that the students are so accustomed to Muzak, that is background music, rather than coming in and listening, they just talk louder over the back of it. So that wasn't an altogether successful experiment. Sometimes I'd say something like this. Now, today we're studying the history of the railroads. Who can name a railroad song? Or I'd say, the Beatles first came to America in 1964. What songs did they sing? And in answer to questions like that, somebody would say, Casey Jones, or She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. Right? And then I'd say, okay, sing it. And usually the students would flatly refuse. They just would not do it. Very occasionally you'd get somebody to mumble out one of the verses. They felt too sheepish to do it. They were totally unprepared for the teacher asking them to sing in that way. That's a justifiable extra credit opportunity, I think. Anyway, that was another of my not particularly successful innovations. On the other hand, when I was invited to give a teaching workshop at one of the seminaries in Atlanta, an evangelical seminary, I asked the group there, the work we were doing was an analysis of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which I often do because it's very, very rich as a text for study. And among other things, in the speech, King uses the words of the song, My Country 'Tis of Thee. And at the end, I asked the group if they'd like to sing it. And they did it absolutely magnificently. In fact, they did it in harmony. And they were totally committed to it. So it was a beautiful moment. Everybody loved it. That's a reminder that educational cultures vary, and that what looks like a horrible innovation in one place is entirely welcome and mainstream in another. I know quite a lot of language teachers, incidentally, who swear by the singing method. If you think about songs like Frère Jacques, it's a great way of learning a little bit of French because it's repetitive, the tune's very catchy and easy to hang on to. And if you can get the class to sing it, it helps to create a sort of classroom community around the common learning of something new. And incidentally, I do think that some of the most creative teaching work that's being done is being done in music departments. Think, for example, of conductors who are leading an ensemble. A good conductor, while he's coaching the group to prepare a piece, is doing an incredible amount of non-verbal communication. Just by how he looks, how he gestures, how he uses the baton, sometimes lifting on his toes or opening his or her hands, a conductor is eliciting from the students a huge range of rhythmic and harmonious effects, very often without using words at all. I think conductors are themselves people very much worthwhile studying for everybody else. So I counsel you to watch a conductor, sometimes with the music playing and sometimes with the music turned off, so you can actually concentrate just on the gestures. Now, without making yourself look ridiculous, try to appropriate the best of these gestures to your own repertoire of effects. I mentioned earlier in the course the fact that we've now got many more technologies than previous generations, some of which have clear, obvious, useful application to teaching. Email, iPods, all the technologies which you fear might come between you and your students can also potentially give you a tremendous opportunity to communicate extra information. And it's a device, of course, that our students are often more comfortable in using than we are. In terms of the technique, we can often learn from them. Listen now to Professor Hale at Louisville and Professor Pollock in Colorado, both of whom have got very interesting comments to make about the good possibilities of the technology.
I love email. I think email is the ideal form of communication in this world because it can never arrive at an untimely moment. You know exactly what you've written before you hit the send button, and it's a permanent record, at least in our system. Even when they're erased, they don't really go away. So if there is a conflict or confusion later on about what happened in class or a response, there it is. And it's so quick, it's so easy. I love email, and I can access mine anywhere I am. And when I'm out in the field for 6 weeks in the summer, I can still communicate with students back on the college campus thanks to email.
I spend very little time on administrative details and syllabus. I make a beautiful web page in advance, and all of that stuff is laid out for them. I will point them to it on the first day of class, and if there's a few highlights, especially something critical like when the exams are, that I think everybody just better know that, I'll spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes out of 50 on the first day with administrative stuff.
As you can see there, Professor Pollock makes the point that having a website for the course frees him up to begin working with class content straight away, rather than worrying about administrative matters. He teaches from day one, and this is an area where obviously it's an advantage to have the website. Another good possibility developed in the last few years is the wiki. The one everyone knows about is the do-it-yourself encyclopedia, Wikipedia. But it's also possible as a teacher to set up a site where the students can contribute material and others can correct and build on it. And it gives you the opportunity as a teacher to make assignments where the students collaborate on putting together a presentation, giving mutual editorial criticisms. Another issue we've discussed several times is how to involve shy and reluctant students who really would rather not speak up in class. If you create a website or a wiki for a class, you can assign a managerial or an editorial role to a student or students of that kind, and this is a viable way of giving them the opportunities to participate in addition to having to speak in class, which they continue to dislike. Now, web video technology is also making it easier than ever before to coordinate your class with one in another country. With a little bit of planning, you and a colleague at a university in Africa or Russia or Britain or the Netherlands can arrange to have periodic class meetings in which the students can compare ideas and can expose each other's assumptions in real time without leaving their classroom, and by now almost free of charge. I watched a wonderful class in this respect where a group of Russian students who are astonishingly good English speakers, as they spoke, disclosed what their assumptions were about America and Americans, nearly all of which were false, and conversely the American students were saying certain things based on what they thought Russia was like, which the Russians greeted with surprise because, again, they were misleading assumptions. And to be able to see one another, even though they were thousands of miles apart, what a wonderful opportunity that is to enhance their learning and understanding of the rest of the world. For classes on history or politics, public health, economics, and many other disciplines, that's very, very useful and becoming easier and more effective from year to year. Here's the thing to remember about the technology. Make the best use of it, but don't ever permit the technology to become a substitute for the basic encounter between the teacher and the student. And always, when you go into class, be ready to teach if the technology fails. As the students become ever more electronically savvy, it's still worthwhile reminding them of the continuing value of traditional sources of information. One of the things I worry about these days is the fate of libraries. Very often I find that unless I compel our students to enter the library, they simply won't go there anymore because they're coming to expect that everything is going to be available to them online instead. Now, the web does have its strengths, I'm not denying that, but it has weaknesses too, particularly shallowness and lack of quality control. In history, for example, there is the tendency for conspiracy theorists to write history from a very, very slanted and contentious point of view. One time when I was teaching Intro to US History, I happened to have exactly 50 students in the class, and so I gave to each one of them a state, one of the 50 states, and said, you've got to go into the Emory Library, and you've got to find that state's historical journal, and you've got to write a paper based on a series of articles that you find in those state journals, and write your paper on the basis of them. Now, I knew that we did in fact have all 50 state historical journals, and I also knew that we didn't have them online and that therefore the students would have to go into the library. And there was a great deal of grumbling among the students about who'd been given which states. Some of them regarded, for example, the assignment of Idaho as rather hard luck because they had to go and look for the issues of a journal called Idaho Yesterdays. But anyway, what happened is that all 50 of them, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, spent days on the 8th floor of the stacks in Emory Library where none of them had been before. A few of them caught the bug and began to understand the value of the library and of browsing its shelves. Now for them, going back to the old ways, the traditional way of getting information, seemed like an innovation because until then they'd really never had the experience. It's a good idea also to try to suit your teaching to the place where you're doing it. Sometimes this is a question of geography. I was astonished on beginning my doctoral program in American history at Berkeley to discover that despite our location on the Pacific coast, we began with the study of Jamestown and the Mayflower. That's actually difficult to justify even if you are living in Virginia or Massachusetts, and it's impossible to justify logically in Berkeley. It would have been far more sensible to begin with the pre-Columbian Indians of California, then move to the Spanish Empire in Mexico and its northward ventures into California, and so on. Now, incidentally, I believe that the fact that America is so big and that it's so various is a very good reason for not having a national curriculum, especially not in things like history, because it stifles local variation and it discourages creativity by stamping the same mold onto everybody. Professor Hale at Louisville encourages his students by talking to them about discoveries made in their own backyard right there in Kentucky.
Have anybody in this group ever been told what Kentucky means? Dark and bloody ground. George Rogers Clark came through about 200 years ago, got to know the chiefs of the Miami and the Shawnee, asked them, "What do you call this land here on the southern side of the Ohio River?" He knew that Ohio meant beautiful river, and they told him that land on the south we call Kentucky, dark and bloody ground.
Place-relevant teaching isn't an option only for historians. Emory's chemistry department runs a superbly creative summer school in northern Italy near the little town of Pisa, where the students split their time between the chemistry of winemaking and the chemistry of painting restoration. It's absolutely the ideal setting for both, because there are vineyards there, and there's a lot of little towns full of Italian art treasures which need a lot of restoration work. So it's the ideal setting for both, and of course there's a delicious dose of tourism thrown in as well to complete the experience. Sometimes it's necessary to come up with something new in response to an unfamiliar cultural setting.
I spoke to the FDIC, right? So these are people who are very risk averse. I mean, these are people who, monitor banks. So it's not a happy, fun-loving cowboy sort of, audience. So literally, I was there one week at Genentech, which is a sort of like, we're going to use technology to change the world sort of thing, right? Place. And you really have to think about, okay, what is the culture of this audience, right? How are they going to respond? What sort of examples, right, should I throw out, right? So in the case of the FDIC, I'm throwing out examples about this stuff is important because you want to avoid big, this will help you avoid big mistakes. This is here's, sort of canary in a coal mine sort of examples, right? Whereas when you talk to a place like, Genentech or Yahoo or something like that, or Google, I'm in there giving examples about changing the world, fabulous innovations, disrupting, organizational structure, right? That sort of stuff, right? So you really want to think about what sort of examples are going to work well with the people. Also I think my persona varies, right? With a place like the FDIC, I want to seem very calm and competent, right, and on top of my game. Whereas with, Yahoo or Google or Genentech, I want to seem like, someone who's, yes, coherent, but also, throwing out lots of ideas that can be played with.
Dr. Page added that there's almost nothing more intimidating than addressing groups of high school students who are often aggressively willing to show that they're too cool to care. And again, he had to come up with a different way of setting about it with this intimidating audience. How do you engage 2,000 terrifying high school students?
I mean, I guess probably two ways. One is that you can't take yourself that seriously. Like you've got to, sort of almost be snarky towards yourself a little bit, like poke fun at yourself, just so that they know that you're not trying to be like, I'm the all-knowing professor telling you something. And I think that calms them a bit. With high school students, I find you don't want to open up with a joke, but you want to get one in there fairly soon, because otherwise they're going to be like, oh no, this is going to be so boring. But then the other thing I do is I just take them really seriously. So I say, look, the next 30 slides are slides I gave at the IMF 2 months ago. And I'm going to give you guys the same slides, right? Because you can handle it and because it's important, right? And they suddenly think, this guy's taking us really seriously. This guy, thinks we've got, that we're smart.
Sometimes innovations can be a response to the seasons. Grade schools often arrange their activities around the calendar for reasons that are understandable, but sometimes a bit disappointing, because these are the sort of things that are usually going to be celebrated at home or with the religious community or the neighbourhood in any case, and don't particularly need reinforcement at school. Think, for example, about how every school does the build-up to Halloween, then to Thanksgiving, then to Hanukkah and Christmas and Kwanzaa and so on, then to Martin Luther King Day. These periodic festivals punctuate the year and structure school activities. I think more schools should try to break out of the box to celebrate unusual anniversaries. For example, why not celebrate the centenary of local electrification, or the 150th anniversary of the first railroad in town, or the 200th anniversary of the first school in town? They tie in with the school curriculum, I'm sure, and would be an interesting variation for the students themselves, helping to reinforce some of the things they were beginning to learn. That, again, would be one of the benefits of thinking about where you're teaching and giving the students a more vivid sense of the particularities of their own place. It's very often possible to be the teacher and the learner at the same time, again by a little bit of use of imagination and making the most of the situation. My own experience in this regard with oral history is relevant. When I was about 35 and my father was about 70, I asked him if he'd consent to do an oral history project with me. I'd asked him if he'd write his life story and he said no. So then I said, well, let's do it with a tape recorder. We'll just talk and then I'll transcribe the tapes and I'll write your life story this way. And he agreed. Now that project was incredibly interesting to me. It gave me a much fuller insight, unexpectedly actually, into the suffering of war. Even though by then I'd been studying the history of warfare for decades. Because here's what I found out from talking with my father, that nearly all his friends from childhood, his boyhood friends, had been killed in the war, mainly as the crew of bombers flying raids over Germany, one of the most dangerous missions you could possibly do in the war. And that gave me a realization I hadn't fully put together before, that the children of war veterans are growing up in the families of the survivors, not the families of the victims. And that causes us to systematically underestimate the destructiveness, especially because we also grew up with Hollywood movies in which the hero virtually always survived. It gave us a misleading idea about the survivability of war. When I was teaching one of these Oxford summer schools, which I mentioned previously, I was teaching about Anglo-American relations in the 20th century. My father came along and spoke to my Oxford summer school class about his experiences in World War II in the Royal Air Force, including some of the time he spent as part of the British military occupation of Palestine in 1944 and 45, just before Israel became independent. Now, to the Jewish students in my group, there were several of them, he was a representative of one of the oppressive forces that the Israelis were eager to get rid of once and for all. But on the other hand, here he was, a cheery 70-year-old man who clearly didn't seem like the kind of menace which they might have learned in learning the conventional history of the origins of Israel. So again, forcing the students to think new thoughts on the basis of this kind of direct encounter. I worked on another oral history project with my neighbour, Reed Crow, in Atlanta. This was in the summer of 2005. And again, it became a different kind of learning as well as teaching experience. I introduced Reed to my class after we worked on the project together, and it's a wonderful thing. It's about growing up in rural Georgia and being a tenant farmer and ploughing with a mule and living with animals, and then about his life as he went into the US Army Air Force, also flew bombing missions, was shot down, parachuted out of a burning plane, was a prisoner of war, and so on. I wrote out the manuscript, gave it to my class with Reed's permission, and they read it. And when they met him, it enabled them to make a direct human connection with an event that for most of them until that time had simply been one more chapter in the textbook. Reed died in 2009. I learned a lot from him, but to my surprise, I taught him as well, because his view at first had been, my life doesn't count as history because I wasn't one of the generals or one of the leaders. He'd never been to college and he didn't know anything about social history. And it was a kind of revelation to him to discover that his experiences as an ordinary enlisted man in the military was itself a very important part of the study of history. So we taught each other in that interchange. I began assigning oral history projects. Children and teenagers needed to be reminded that everyone around them was a child once. And that means that the older people are now, the longer ago their childhood took place, and the more likely they are to have lived through drastic shifts. In Atlanta, where I live, everyone over the age of 50 has got vivid memories of racial segregation. And people who are in their 80s now, black and white, grew up in a world where segregation was normal. Once the students have that pointed out to them, they suddenly see what a resource such people can be. However, it's one thing to know it, and it's another thing to turn it into a successful teaching strategy. If you're going to have your students interviewing old citizens, you need to plan it very carefully. How do you make contact? You can't expect to just walk up to an old person and say, let me interview you about how segregation affected your life. Another of my great innovations that failed was really along those lines. I was teaching American religious history, and I required every student in the class to select one Atlanta area church or temple or synagogue different from the one they'd grown up in. And then they were charged with interviewing the priest or minister or rabbi and some members of the congregation, and then writing the history of that congregation. Didn't work very well. The project was too ambitious. and the students didn't know enough etiquette not to accidentally tread on the toes of the people they were trying to cultivate. And the result was several baffled students and even a few disgruntled phone calls. Don't forget to look at the current research on educational methodology, which is constantly suggesting innovations. So much has changed in the field of education and learning, and there's an incredible amount of literature for new teachers available in journals, in libraries, and online. Now let's sum up the findings from this lecture. There's a valuable place for creativity and innovation in teaching. The issue is knowing when and where and how to use it. Make certain that your innovations support the theme of your course, and that they're compatible with your personality and your skills. If you yourself are unwilling to sing or to draw, even though you shouldn't be, you cannot really, in fairness, ask your students to do either. Novelties for their own sake are no use, especially if you let the students come to depend on them. They ought to be depending on the steady routine that you establish right up front and just occasionally have a pleasant deviation. Very occasionally, pure theatre is defensible, but usually your innovations have got to have a clear point, a clear connection to what it is you're teaching. Give the students a sense of anticipation, that there's always a leavening to the routine and a sense of the unexpected or the amusing just around the corner. Let the students' pleasure in learning grow chiefly out of the material itself, but don't miss opportunities to take advantage of the place you're in, the date, or the special circumstances of the moment. And look for ways to learn as well as to teach, trying to look beyond the conventional structure of your educational situation. Seek out the latest research on teaching and learning for more ideas. And take a moment to refresh your memory of what you loved about your field of study and your own early commitment to teaching before you begin to teach it. From here, in the next lecture, I'm going to go on to review some of the most common misconceptions about education that are very widespread today.